Well, welcome back. In a previous session, we looked at blood gas transport, carriage of oxygen and CO2 by the blood, and we're now going on to look at CO2 transport in more detail, in the sense that it very much influences the acid-base balance of the body. So this session is going to be devoted to acid-base balance, and then at the end of it, I'm just going to add a little bit about oxygen transfer to the tissues. Now, why is CO2 so important in acid-base balance? Well, it turns out that the body puts out about 240 mils per minute of CO2 all day long, and this is equivalent to something like 10,000 milliequivalents per day. Whereas the kidney, which is the other organ particularly concerned with acid-base balance, only puts out about 100 milliequivalents of fixed acid. So you can see that the lung has an enormous role in acid-base balance, and furthermore, by altering ventilation, we can rapidly control the acid-base status, and that's why we're going to consider that in this series on respiratory physiology. I should say, though, that the renal people, the renal physiologists, also are very concerned with acid-base balance, and so they would also have a contribution to make. Well, now let's start by looking at a couple of definitions here. An acid is a molecule that releases hydrogen ions in solution. A base is a molecule that can accept a hydrogen ion. And a buffer is a substance that can reversibly bind hydrogen ions. So let's look at the buffering systems of the blood. The definition, as you see here, is that a hydrogen ion is taken up by a buffer, and that's given, the result is over here. And the most important buffer system in the blood is the bicarbonate system, where the hydrogen ion is combined with a bicarbonate ion to give carbonic acid. Proteins also, though, have important buffering functions, particularly hemoglobin, which is a predominant protein in the blood, and they can take part in the reaction as shown here, the hydrogen ion plus the protein, to give a combination here. And the proteins work principally through the C-terminal carboxyl ends and the N-terminal amine groups. Those are the groups that are particularly important in the protein system. There's also a phosphate system shown at the bottom here, but that is less important than the other two systems, and we're going to be concentrating on the bicarbonate system here. Now, this shows what's called the titration curve for the bicarbonate buffer system. What this shows is the pH along this axis here, and here we're showing on the left-hand side what happens when you add carbonic acid or carbon dioxide to the solution, 0 to 100%. And what happens on this side, what this side shows, is the amount of buffer in the form of bicarbonate, the amount of bicarbonate ion that you're adding to the system. And you can see that there's an S-shaped curve when you plot these two variables together. And the maximum slope is at the center of this curve here, and that's called the pK. That's the maximum buffering region where adding acid or alkali causes the smallest change in pH. And you'll notice that this point, also known as the pK for the bicarbonate system, is at a pH of about 6.1. Actually, the normal operating point in the body, of course, is 7.4, and you could argue that the system would do better if the pK were closer to 7.4, but the buffering system does pretty well as it is, and not for us to try and change it. Okay, let's look at the bicarbonate reactions in a little bit more detail here. So when carbon dioxide is combined with water, it forms carbonic acid. And it does this under the influence of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. You remember we talked about that when we looked at blood gas transport and made the point that the red cells contain carbonic anhydrase, substantial amount, so this reaction is very fast within the red cell, but it's very slow in the plasma in the absence of the red cell because plasma does not contain carbonic anhydrase. And then the carbonic acid, of course, dissociates into a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion. And we can use the law of mass action to write down an equilibrium constant, which is shown here. It's the product of these two on the right-hand side of the equation, divided by this on the left-hand side. So it's the concentration of hydrogen ions times the concentration of bicarbonate ions over the concentration of carbonic acid. And for the carbonic acid, we can write the solubility of carbon dioxide times the PCO2. So that allows us to get PCO2 into the equation. Now, what do you think the solubility of CO2 is? Well, you remember when we talked about the carriage of oxygen and CO2 by the blood, we pointed out that oxygen has a solubility of 0.003 mils per deciliter per millimeter of mercury, and we said that CO2 had a solubility of 0.067 mils of CO2 per deciliter per millimeter of mercury. So you may say, what's this 0.03 doing here for solubility? Well, the answer is that we're using different units. Here we're talking in terms of millimoles per liter per millimeter of mercury. Previously we were talking in terms of mils of CO2 per deciliter of blood, and that explains the difference in the constants. So the constant we're going to be using here for the solubility is 0.03. Now we can rearrange this equation and take logarithms, and I'm not going to do that in detail, but if you do that, you end up with the equation here that the pH is equal to the pK, which we saw was 6.1 for the bicarbonate system, plus the log of the ratio of bicarbonate to carbonic acid, or in this case 0.03 times PCO2. And that's known as the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. It's a very important equation, and we're going to be using it extensively. And incidentally, we can see immediately that if the ratio of bicarbonate to PCO2 remains constant, then the pH is going to remain constant, okay? On the other hand, if we raise the bicarbonate concentration, keeping the PCO2 constant, then the pH will rise, and by contrast, if we keep the bicarbonate concentration constant and we increase the PCO2, then the pH has to fall. And we're going to look at those processes in detail. Now, it's interesting to derive the normal pH of 7.4 from the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, and that's just shown here. Here's the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, pH equals pK plus the log of HCO3 bicarbonate over 0.03 times PCO2. And pK, as we saw, was 6.1. The normal bicarbonate concentration in plasma is 24 millimoles. The normal PCO2, as we know, is 40. So 0.03 times 40 gives us 1.2. So we've got 24 over 1.2, and the ratio then is 20. The log of 2 is 0.3. The log of 20 is 1.3. So now we've got the pH equals 6.1 plus 1.3 equals 7.4. Isn't that nice? That's the way the normal pH comes out of the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation when we put in the appropriate levels for bicarbonate and PCO2. Now we're going to be looking at the interrelationships between PCO2, pH, and bicarbonate. So we've got three variables. And there are various diagrams for looking at the interactions between these variables. There must be a dozen or so out there. But the one that we find most convenient is called the Davenport Diagram, and that's the one we're going to use. And here's the backbone of the Davenport Diagram shown here. As you can see, on the vertical axis, we've got plasma bicarbonate. On the horizontal axis, we've got pH. And we've got these lines of constant PCO2 ranging across the diagram. Sometimes those are called isopleths. Isopleths meaning a constant value for the variable, in this case PCO2. And let's start by trying to understand how we would derive one of the isopleths for PCO2, and that's shown here. Here's the same diagram, plasma bicarbonate on this axis, pH on this axis, and here's the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation up here for a PCO2 of 40. Okay, so PCO2 of 40 times 0.03, the solubility gives us 1.2. And so what we do is we put a point on this diagram indicating the normal situation. The normal situation is a bicarbonate of 24 milliequivalents per liter, a pH of 7.4, and so there we are. That's our normal point. Now we vary the bicarbonate concentration in this equation and calculate the change in pH. So as we alter as we say raise the bicarbonate concentration, we find the pH increases and we follow along this line here. As we decrease the bicarbonate concentration, we find the pH falls and we go along the line here. So that's how we derive the isopleth for the normal PCO2 of 40. We do the same for all the other values of PCO2. Very simple to do, very simple calculation, and that gives us this fan or this sequence of lines on the diagram here for different PCO2 values. Incidentally, just notice, because sometimes beginning students get confused here, from left to right the PCO2 is falling. Sometimes people, when they're putting the diagram together, they get those round the wrong way. Okay, now there's another line on the Davenport diagram that's extremely important, and we introduce it here. And this is the buffer line for carbonic acid. Now the buffer line is what you get if you take a sample of blood, normal blood, and you expose it to increasing or decreasing PCO2 levels. Okay? Suppose we take a sample of blood and we increase, and that would have, say, the normal arterial blood will have a PCO2 of 40, pH 7.4, bicarbonate of 24. So normal value as we saw before. Now suppose we expose this blood to an increased PCO2 concentration. We expose it in a tonometer to gas containing an increased PCO2. Then what we would find is that we'd go up this line here. For example, if we doubled the PCO2 to 80, we would find that we had, of course, a PCO2 of 80, a bicarbonate of, what is it, about 30, and a pH of about 7.2, something like that. So this is an experimentally derived line as we take a normal sample of blood and expose it to different CO2 levels. The same thing happens if we take the normal sample again, and we reduce the PCO2 in the gas to which the blood is exposed, then we'll move along this part of the buffer line. So this is the buffer line for carbonic acid, if you like, with normal blood. Now the slope of the buffer line depends on various things, including the concentration of hemoglobin. The more hemoglobin we have, the steeper the slope of the buffer line. Why? Because with more hemoglobin, we've got more buffering effect, and therefore the change in PCO2 along this axis is going to be less for a given change in the change in, did I say PCO? The change in pH along the horizontal axis here is going to be less for a given change in PCO2. So the buffer line, the slope of the buffer line depends on the varying on the buffering capacity. It's also true, for example, that in the body, the slope of the buffer line is slightly different from that in blood taken from the body and outside the body because of the action of the interstitial fluid, the extravascular interstitial fluid. Okay, so that's the buffer line, and those are the PCO2 isopleths. Now let's go to the 4 types of acid-base disturbances. And they fall into a nice pattern here. I don't think you'll find it difficult to follow this. It's a nice pattern. And the first one we're going to deal with is respiratory acidosis. Okay? Respiratory acidosis. Well, now with respiratory acidosis, what we're going to do is we're going to raise the PCO2. And therefore, we're going to, and that's all we're doing, raising the PCO2, and therefore we're going to move along the buffer line. And what we see is that the PCO2 is increased, and going along the buffer line, of course, the plasma bicarbonate increases and the pH decreases. Sometimes students at the beginning will say, well, if all you're doing is adding CO2, why does the bicarbonate increase? Well, of course, it increases because when you add CO2, you're forming not only hydrogen ions, but bicarbonate ions as well, and therefore both of them change. The increase in hydrogen ion concentration will cause the pH to fall, and then the increase in bicarbonate concentration will cause the bicarbonate to rise. Okay, now, as you know, as we've talked, well, first of all, let me say, how far has the PCO2 changed here? Well, in this particular example, the PCO2 has changed from 40 to 80, so it's actually doubled. That means that other things being equal, the alveolar ventilation is halved, okay, because that comes from the alveolar ventilation equation that we've used extensively. Inverse relationship between the PCO2 and the level of ventilation. So here we've got a situation where the alveolar ventilation has halved and the PCO2 has gone from 40 up to 80. Okay, now the body, as you have heard, as we've discussed many times, is very, quotes, reluctant to see the pH change. A change in pH alters the function of enzymes in the body. It changes the conformation of proteins. It has central nervous system effects. The body does not like a change in pH. And so it tries to prevent that. I'm talking now anthropologically. There are mechanisms that tend to reduce that, I should say. And the way the body responds to this respiratory acidosis is to have the kidney retain more bicarbonate. And as it retains more bicarbonate, we move along the CO2 isopleth because we're assuming here that what the kidney is doing is not changing the ventilation. The ventilation is reduced because maybe the patient has taken an overdose of some drug that has reduced alveolar ventilation. That's why the PCO2 has risen. And we're assuming the PCO2 remains at 80, but the kidney is conserving bicarbonate. And so we're moving up the isopleth for a PCO2 of 80. And we might end up here. And you can see that what this has done, as well as increasing the bicarbonate concentration, of course, is it has increased the pH, brought the pH back towards the normal level. In fact, this might go even further. It's possible, although actually unlikely, that the increase in bicarbonate concentration should be so great that the pH is brought back to the normal value. That actually, in practice, hardly ever happens. Usually the compensation, and we call it metabolic compensation because it's the kidney that's doing it, metabolic compensation for the respiratory alkalosis is never complete. And so we normally end up with a partially compensated respiratory acidosis, okay? And this one shows, just out of interest, a fully compensated one here. Now we have a name for the distance between the point, the vertical distance between the point and the normal buffer line. And that is called the base excess. It's a measure, you see, of the amount of bicarbonate which has been added. And the base excess, in this case, the example I'm showing here, this is about 24, this is about 48, so what's that? Something like 24, if I've got my sums right, would be the base excess in milliequivalents per liter, something like 24. Okay. Okay, so that's respiratory acidosis. let's go on now to respiratory alkalosis. And perhaps before I do that, let's just mention what are the causes of respiratory acidosis. Well, I mentioned alveolar hypoventilation, and that can be caused, for example, by an overdose of certain drugs, cause hypoventilation. Morphine derivatives, for example, can do that. That would be one example. Another cause, though, of an increased PCO2, you recall, is ventilation perfusion inequality. That's a cause that some people are still a bit confused about, but ventilation perfusion inequality, you remember, affects the transfer of all gases by the lung, including carbon dioxide, so ventilation perfusion inequality can cause an increased PCO2. So the two main mechanisms of an increased PCO2 are hypoventilation, ventilation perfusion inequality. Okay, let's go now to alkalosis, which is the exact opposite, okay? In alkalosis, the primary change is in the PCO2. The PCO2 now falls, and this can be caused, for example, by hypoventilation. That would be the principal cause. Hyperventilation can occur in normal people because of anxiety or hysterical hyperventilation. Another example would be somebody going to high altitude, where the low PO2 in the air at high altitude stimulates the peripheral chemoreceptors, increases ventilation, drives down the PCO2. Again, following the alveolar ventilation equation. So in this case, what we've got is a PCO2 which has fallen from 40 to 20. And that means that the alveolar ventilation has been doubled. Okay, inverse relationship between the PCO2 and the level of ventilation. Okay, so what happens if we have respiratory alkalosis with hyperventilation, a reduced PCO2? Well, then the next thing that happens is that we can get, and here's the arrow shown there, next thing that can happen is that we can have a metabolic compensation for the respiratory alkalosis. In this case, we move down along the isopleth for a PCO of 20. See, again, we're assuming that the metabolic compensation is not affecting the root cause of the low PCO2. This patient is still at high altitude, is still ventilating high, and has a low PCO2, but the kidney now is going to excrete bicarbonate and thus reduce the plasma bicarbonate concentration and bring the pH back toward the normal level. Okay? So this is metabolic compensation, and again, it's rarely complete. Normally what we see is a partial compensation for the respiratory alkalosis. So the technical name for this would be respiratory alkalosis with partial metabolic compensation. Okay, let's now go to the next cause, which is metabolic acidosis. Now, metabolic acidosis and alkalosis are caused by primary changes in the level of bicarbonate. Up to now, we've been looking at the primary changes in the PCO2 level. Now we're going to look at the primary changes in bicarbonate. And metabolic acidosis occurs when the bicarbonate concentration is reduced. And you can see we're going along this line here, low bicarbonate here. We're assuming with this metabolic abnormality that the ventilation hasn't changed, okay? And we're simply going down the isopleth for PCO2 and ending up down here. Now, what could cause a metabolic acidosis? Well, any acids added to the blood. For example, in uncontrolled diabetes, or diabetes mellitus is the correct name for it, in uncontrolled diabetes, there are keto acids that are put out, and these are a relatively common cause in poorly treated diabetes. These can cause a severe metabolic acidosis. Another example would be lactate put out. If the tissues in the body, perhaps postoperatively or during an operation, become very hypoxic, those tissues will produce lactate, and that is another cause of metabolic acidosis, frequently occurs. So in this case, there's quite a severe metabolic acidosis. The pH has fallen from 7.4 to 7.1 or so. And of course, we've got a very acid situation. Now, again, the body doesn't like that. It would like to return the pH towards the normal level. How can we do this? Well, we can do this in part, at least, by respiratory compensation. And what the respiratory compensation does is it moves us along the buffer line, because what we're doing here is we're going to increase the ventilation and blow off CO2, and that, in a sense, is exposing blood to a lower CO2 on the buffer line. It's a new buffer line, okay, this one down here, and we're going to move along the new buffer line, which is parallel to the original buffer line here, because the buffering power of the blood, the buffering characteristics of the blood haven't changed, and we're going to move along the buffer line here, say to a PCO2 of 20, okay? So now we have a partially compensated metabolic acidosis. You notice that the pH has been brought back from about 7.1 to 7.2. It's still quite acidotic, but not quite so much as it was. And what we have is a respiratory response, respiratory compensation for the metabolic acidosis. So we're going to end up down here. So this is a common situation. What causes the increase in ventilation? Of course, we need an increase in ventilation to reduce the PCO2 from 40 to 20. Well, what causes it is the increased hydrogen ion concentration of the blood stimulating the peripheral chemoreceptors. So a patient with metabolic acidosis, say from uncontrolled diabetes, that patient will be seen to be hyperventilating because the patient has a low pH in the arterial blood, high hydrogen ion concentration, stimulating the peripheral chemoreceptors, and that increases the ventilation. Okay, let's now turn to the last of the four abnormalities, and that is metabolic alkalosis. Now, it's exactly the opposite of what we talked about before. Since, here's the normal value here, and since we're not changing ventilation, we're going to be moving along the CO2 isopleth, but in this case, with a metabolic alkalosis, the bicarbonate concentration has been increased, okay? And therefore we move up this line, and the point is up here. What could cause a metabolic alkalosis? Well, a loss of gastric acids, for example, could cause it. In fact, there's a condition in newborn babies called pyloric stenosis, where the baby has a block at the end of the stomach and can't push fluid or milk through it, and vomits, and often projectile vomiting, and those babies often develop a metabolic alkalosis because they're losing so much of their gastric juice, which is very acid. Another cause sometimes seen is people who take very large amounts of alkalotic drugs in order to, because they've got heartburn or something, they take a lot of Tums or whatever they are, and this gives them, if you take enough, a metabolic alkalosis. Now, compensation, respiratory compensation for a metabolic alkalosis is often not seen. There may be a very slight amount perhaps, but usually this is not the case because in this case, of course, the pH is rising, and that usually doesn't have much effect on the peripheral chemoreceptors. Actually, in this particular instance, the artist has drawn a partial respiratory compensation for the metabolic alkalosis, okay? Now we're moving up the new buffer line here, and this buffer line is parallel to this one. And incidentally, as I said before, if you want to report the base excess, it's the distance between the two buffer lines. And I meant to mention that when I talked about metabolic acidosis, and I forgot to do it. But the distance between the point, the vertical distance between the point and the buffer line, or the vertical distance between the two buffer lines, is called the base excess. If the distance is down here, you can call it a negative base excess if you want, or you can call it a base deficit. Both terms are used. Okay. Now, the artist has drawn here an example of complete respiratory compensation for metabolic alkalosis. Actually, it never occurs. Take it from me, it never occurs. But what it points out is something interesting, that you can reach the same point by two very different processes. You see, in this case, it's been a metabolic alkalosis with respiratory compensation, or it's been a respiratory acidosis, going from 40 to 80, with a metabolic compensation. And they both end up at the same point. And so what the artist is making the point that sometimes you can reach the same point on the Davenport diagram by two different methods. This one it's extremely unlikely that this would happen with metabolic alkalosis. I don't think it ever happens. But the opposite sometimes does. Sometimes if you've got a respiratory alkalosis, where you come down below the buffer line here, a respiratory alkalosis and a compensated metabolic acidosis, they can end up at the same point here. And this just brings out the fact that some of these acid-base abnormalities are pretty complicated, and it takes us a while to sort out what's happening. There are different paths through which different paths that can be taken on the Davenport diagram. Okay, so that's, I think, all we're going to say about the acid-base balance. It's a nice, clean area of physiology, in my opinion. The Davenport diagram is extremely valuable, and by plotting the movement of the points in this way, we can clearly see what happens with respiratory acidosis or alkalosis, metabolic acidosis or alkalosis, both with their compensating movements. Now I'm going to change gears a bit here, because when we talked about the transport of oxygen and CO2 to the blood, we ended up at the peripheral capillaries pretty much. And we did not deal with oxygen delivery to the tissues. We didn't have time, that's why. And this is a convenient time to do it now. Consider this as a sort of coda to the discussion of oxygen and CO2 transport. Of course, acid-base is closely linked to oxygen and CO2 transport, which is why we've been looking at it here. And here's a nice diagram, which very pretty, and shows us how we can compare the movement of oxygen from the lungs into the pulmonary capillaries and from the systemic capillaries to the mitochondria. The point is that the initial movement to the blood-gas barrier is by ventilation. Okay? Now, one little caveat here, though, is that the final movement in the acini is actually by diffusion in the gas phase. But let's call the whole of that ventilation. Okay? The movement of inspired oxygen to the blood-gas barrier. And then oxygen is going to move across the blood-gas barrier by diffusion. Remember, we devoted a whole session to that because it's an important concept. And once the oxygen is in the pulmonary capillary blood, of course, it's moved around by a convective process called perfusion. Well, I should say ventilation is convective too. This is diffusion, and this is another convective process, perfusion, within the blood vessels. And so the oxygen finds its way then to the systemic capillaries, say, of the leg. And once it gets to the systemic capillaries, again, the same processes occur. It's got to diffuse across the wall of the capillary and through the tissue to the mitochondria, where the oxygen is eventually utilized. Okay? So it's a nice, if you like, a nice pattern here, a nicely balanced pattern of ventilation, diffusion, perfusion, and diffusion again within the tissue. Now, there are important differences between diffusion from the alveolar gas into the pulmonary capillary blood on the one hand, and diffusion from the systemic capillary blood through the tissues to the mitochondria on the other hand. And the main difference is the distances. The distance here from the alveolar gas to the interior of the red cell is what, 3 or 4 microns. The red cell diameter is about 7 microns. Of course, the diffusion across the blood gas barrier itself is only about 0.3 of a micron. It's very, very short. But the blood still has to go through the lumen of the capillary, through the plasma or through the red cell to the center here. And so we're talking about 3 or 4 microns of distance. Not so in the tissues. In the tissues, for example, muscle, the capillaries are of the order of 50 microns apart. So you've got a much bigger diffusion path for the gases to traverse. And that's a big difference between the two diffusion processes. Now, if we look at the Fick equation again, and we've seen this now 2 or 3 times, you remember we pointed out that, well, first, just to recap, the volume of gas going through a tissue slice here, proportional to the area of the slice, inversely proportional to its thickness, proportional to a diffusion constant called the diffusivity, and the partial pressure difference between the two. Now, this diffusion constant, you remember, is given by the solubility of the gas in the tissue divided by the molecular weight. Now, remember we calculated that for CO2 and oxygen and found that the value of D, the diffusivity, was about 20 times greater for CO2 than for oxygen. Why? Because the solubility of CO2 is about 24 times, 0.067 over 0.003, something like that. The molecular weights are slightly different. CO2 is 44, oxygen's 32, but by the time you take the square root, the difference is less. And so the net result of this equation is that diffusion occurs about 20 times faster for CO2 than it does for oxygen. So it's generally believed that in peripheral tissues, CO2 is not a problem. Oxygen is the one we're concerned about. CO2, because of its high diffusivity, is probably not a problem at all. Now let's look at an interesting problem, and that is the distribution of PO2 between capillaries in the periphery. And we'll take the leg or the arm or whatever. And initially you may find the diagram confusing, but this area here, which is a shaded area, is meant to represent the capillary. Okay, and this shaded area is a capillary, and we're looking at the profile of the tissue PO2 between the two capillaries. That's what we're looking at here. Now, as oxygen diffuses away from the capillary towards the tissue, and of course it's going to be used in the mitochondria here, the PO2 falls. It falls because the oxygen is being consumed by the tissue. In fact, of course, if the PO2 was not falling, there'd be no diffusion of tissue out. The oxygen only diffuses along a partial pressure gradient. At any event, you can see that under normal conditions, say, the pattern is like this. We've got an area of lowest PO2 in the center of this tissue between the two capillaries here. But everything here is getting oxygenated as we would hope. But now let's look at the next example here, shown as B. In this case, the oxygen consumption of the tissue, or the oxygen available from the capillary, one or the other, means that the PO2 has fallen to 0 at some point between the two open capillaries. Okay, that would be probably midway between the two capillaries and probably at the downstream end of the capillaries where the PO2 values are least. Okay, and so now we've got what's called a critical situation. A critical situation where this tissue is only just getting oxygenated. And even worse happens if we go to C here. In C, there's a whole region where the PO2 has fallen to 0. And so this is a very serious problem. Maybe this occurs in the intensive care unit to some extent. And this tissue, of course, cannot undergo metabolism, oxygen using metabolism. If it's going to survive, it's got to produce ATP by anaerobic glycolysis, and that it can do, and that will produce lactate as a result. So we've got a problem here, and again, this is likely to be in the center between two capillaries and presumably at the downstream end. So that's tissue hypoxia. Now, how far can the PO2 fall before the mitochondria get into difficulties? Well, it turns out, and this is very interesting, and it's been shown fairly recently now, that if you look at tissue, the main pressure drop in partial pressure, occurs at the capillary wall. And if you look at muscle tissue, for example, that's where most of the fall in the PO2 occurs. And that in the muscle itself, the PO2 is reasonably constant and also extremely low. It turns out that in exercising muscle at rest, the PO2 is of the order of 2, 3, 4 millimeters of mercury, extraordinarily low. So you may say, well, why is the arterial PO2 so high at 100, and why is the PO2 in the peripheral capillaries so high? It goes from 100 or so down to the mixed venous value of 40 or so. Why is it so high? Well, it's high because you need the pressure gradient to move the oxygen from the tissue to the mitochondria. It's not that there is a big fall along the muscle itself, the muscle tissue itself. Apparently the big fall is at the capillary wall. So how much oxygen does a mitochondrion need to respire? And that's an interesting question, and we don't know exactly, but here's some nice data. Here's the oxygen uptake of mitochondria here, plotted against the PO2. Now, of course, these measurements are made in an in vitro situation. These are actually, I believe these are liver mitochondria in a dish of some kind, and they're able to measure the oxygen consumption as the PO2 is reduced. But the carry-home point is that you can reduce the PO2 in this example to about 2 millimeters of mercury before you see a fall in the mitochondrial consumption, oxygen consumption. So this means that the mitochondria don't need a great deal of oxygen in order to respire. And just to recap, the reason why the PO2 values are so much higher in the peripheral capillary blood is to maintain a necessary PO2 gradient from the blood to the mitochondria so the oxygen can get there. Now, if we don't have enough oxygen in tissue, it's called tissue hypoxia. And a number of years ago, people used this classification. I'm not sure that it's terribly helpful, but I'm going to mention it briefly. There are 4 types of tissue hypoxia. One is what was called hypoxic hypoxia. That's the sort of thing you get at high altitude, where the PO2 in the arterial blood is low because the PO2 in the air around the climber is low, and that causes tissue hypoxia. Hypoxic hypoxia is the name given to that. The next one is anemic hypoxia, which, as its name implies, has to do with anemia, has to do with a low oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. And that's seen in a patient with anemia. There are many types of anemia, and I mentioned, I think the other day, Pernicious anemia, which is a condition where you get extremely low levels of hemoglobin. And of course, since the blood is not able to carry much oxygen to the tissues may become hypoxic. The amount of oxygen being delivered to the tissues, of course, is the blood flow times the oxygen concentration. Okay, and if the amount of oxygen that can be carried by the blood is reduced because of severe anemia, low concentration of red blood cells, that's anemic hypoxia. The third cause is circulatory hypoxia, where you have maybe a general reduction in cardiac output as occurs during circulatory shock. A patient following a road accident will go into what's known as shock, where the blood pressure falls precipitously and the circulation is greatly reduced. And that's called circulatory hypoxia. And of course, that can cause, obviously can cause a low PO2 in the tissues because although you may have a lot of oxygen in the blood, it's not getting to the tissues. So that's quite clear. The most interesting one actually is histotoxic hypoxia. And that's a situation where where all the other things are normal, but there is a poison in the tissue that prevents the tissue from utilizing oxygen. And the best example of that is cyanide poisoning. With cyanide poisoning, the the mitochondrial mechanism is interfered with, and so the body can't make ATP from the oxygen that's being delivered, and the tissues become extremely hypoxic. That's an interesting form of hypoxia in that in histotoxic hypoxia, the venous blood draining from the tissue has a high oxygen concentration. There's nothing wrong with the amount of oxygen getting to the tissue, but the tissue can't remove the oxygen from the tissue. So that's called histotoxic hypoxia. So let me briefly summarize then some of the points we've made in this session. We pointed out that the acid-base status of the body is very closely related to CO2 transport, that the lung deals with far more acids over the course of a day, carbonic acid, than the kidney does over the course of a day. So one up for the lung in terms of acid-base status. We talked about a few definitions, the definitions of acid, base, and buffer. We looked at the titration curve of the carbonic buffer system and pointed out how we determined that the pH, that the pK, the equilibrium constant, is 6.1 for that system. And we then derive the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, which is critical to understanding acid-base status. We use the Davenport diagram. There are others as well, but the Davenport diagram I think is a particularly useful one. Talked about the CO2 isopleths and the blood buffer line. And then we went to the four principal acid-base disturbances, the primary acid-base disturbances. We had respiratory acidosis and alkalosis, and then we had metabolic acidosis and alkalosis, and we talked about the compensations. For the respiratory abnormalities, you get a metabolic compensation where the kidney either increases or decreases the level of bicarbonate in the blood. And for the metabolic abnormalities, we talked about respiratory compensation, where for metabolic acidosis, for example, there's an increase in ventilation, and the reverse for metabolic alkalosis, although that may often not occur. In fact, usually doesn't occur, but those compensations are available. And we also pointed out that on the Davenport diagram, sometimes you can end up at the same point on the diagram from two different paths. And sometimes, I should add, these acid-base disturbances can be very complicated. Sometimes they're confused. A patient with severe disease has so many abnormalities that it's sometimes quite difficult to work out exactly what has happened, but the principles are what I've indicated here. Finally, we talked about oxygen delivery of tissues. We pointed out that the Fick equation for diffusion is a bit of a problem in the tissues because of the distance that that oxygen and CO2 have to cover, more like 50 microns in the tissues compared with less than 5 in the lung. We did, however, point out that the problem is going to be for oxygen, not CO2, because the rate at which CO2 diffuses through tissue is some 50 times that of oxygen. We mentioned that the PO2 between the capillaries can fall to a critical level under some conditions, and under some conditions it falls to 0, and then presumably anaerobic glycolysis takes over. We also pointed out that the mitochondria actually work at a very low PO2 level, or can work at a very low PO2 level, and that, you remember in the example I showed, you can reduce the PO2 to around about 2 millimeters of mercury before the mitochondria stop utilizing oxygen. And we ended up with a brief classification of the types of tissue hypoxia. So that's all I'm going to say about this interesting topic of acid-base status, a very important topic in the clinical setting, by the way, desperately important topic in the clinical setting, and hope to see you next time.